In this video, we're going to go through the Catcher in the Rye portion of the study guide, which I have up on the screen here. This is exactly what you will find on the study guide that I handed out in class. So we'll just go through things kind of one at a time. So the first thing on the study guide is writing style, and it lists profanity, digression, and slang. These are elements that the writer uses to try to make the narrator sound like he has the voice of a real teenager, or at least a teenager of the 1940s or 50s. So to begin with profanity, of course, that's referring to bad language that Holden uses. He uses it in almost every sentence, no matter who he's talking to. At several points in the book, there are characters who point out to him that he's swearing too much, but it seems to just be a part of how he talks. He doesn't even think about it. I do want to point out, though, that towards the end of the book, he makes a pretty big deal about the use of the F word when he finds it written in the school and in the museum. So it seems that even though some swear words are sort of just second nature to Holden, he doesn't even think about using them. There is a line for him, it's an interesting thing to think about, you know, where he draws the line and what he considers to be right and wrong. Perhaps he should be thinking about the wrongness of his other swearing as well. Second part of style is digression. This is kind of probably one of the most notable things about the book is how the narrator is unable to stay on topic. We talked in class about how in the course of the book we cover less than 48 hours or right around 48 hours. And that makes up for the whole book. There's not a lot that he does in the book. So much of it takes place in his head, whether that includes flashbacks or, just other random thoughts that he has about things, sometimes even imagining situations. Digression means that he is rarely able to stay on the same topic for very long. And then lastly, slang, again, something to try to make it sound like the language of a particular character, to make it realistic, like somebody's really talking. So I have some examples of slang here up on the slide. These are some of the same words that you had on the worksheet that we did at the very beginning, where I kind of gave you a challenge to see how many slang words from the 1940s or 50s you would know. You don't need to know the meaning of these individual slang words or expressions, but being able to recognize them as such, I think, is important. Remember from the very beginning of the year, we talked about slang being really informal speech and something that is a lot of times unique to a particular group of people. There's some slang that only exists, for example, at Mount Michael. There's also, but more notably, there's slang that really exists for particular eras or generations, and slang changes a lot, doesn't stick around for very long a lot of times. So some of the slang he uses is fairly similar to things that you would hear today. Some might be things that you've heard maybe your grandparents say, and some of it might just be stuff that you've never heard of before at all. So we're going to skip down a couple on the study guide here. We will come back to the unreliable narrator in a bit. But the idea of a frame story, this describes the structure of the novel, Catcher in the Rye, how it's put together. And the idea is that there's a story inside of a story. And I'll give you kind of a visual to try to remind you of how that all works. But first I wanted to give you some quotations from the very beginning and the very end of the novel that help indicate to us that he is in a different place than where he is in the story, that the story he tells us is essentially a flashback. So that starts on the very first page with him saying he's not going to tell us his whole autobiography. He's just going to tell us this stuff that happened to him around last Christmas before he got pretty run down and had to come out here and take it easy. So somewhere where he would go when he got run down, like he has bad health, or whether that be physical or mental, and had to take it easy, somewhere where he can recover. Then we also have him saying that DB is in Hollywood, which isn't too far. He talks about DB coming to visit him, and that maybe DB is going to drive him home next month, maybe. And then he also talks about kind of what happens at this place. Again, not a lot of detail, but he says first off that there's that this, whatever this place is, he gets these checkups and stuff. They made him quit smoking. And then lastly, we also have that there's a psychoanalyst guy, which, I mean, that could mean he's in a mental hospital. It could mean he's in a juvenile detention center. Could be a regular hospital, but whatever it is, there's somewhere where he's getting some kind of counseling or therapy. So we don't know exactly where he's telling the story from. He never gives us that specific information, but we do know that it's in California near Hollywood, somewhere where he can go to kind of recover. So, in terms of understanding kind of how the story is put together, for a frame story, like I said before, it's a story within a story. So, on the overall story that starts at the beginning of the book, we have him in California. He's either at a mental hospital or he's in a maybe juvenile detention, wherever he is. He's telling us the story from there, and he is telling the story as a flashback. So I'm going to kind of put all of his everything in sort of a speech bubble there, because that's essentially what he's doing. He's telling us a story of a plot of things that happened about a year ago. So that means that, as he flashes back here now, we're starting off with his story at Pensy, where he talks about how he got kicked out, and Stradlater and Ackley, and leaving and then going and staying in the hotel and all of this stuff. And honestly, I think I would have a hard time picking out exactly where we go, where we have the hook, where we have the rising action. But ultimately, his time in New York City, all the way through to the end where he's at the carousel, still in New York City, but he's decided that he's going to stay, and he's there with Phoebe. And then in the very last chapter of the book, he returns again to the outside world that he's in, this outside world where he's telling the story from in California. So frame story is story within a story, and that's kind of how it works for Catcher in the Rye. So then one other notable thing about the way that the way this story is told is that Holden is an unreliable narrator. And in the very beginning of the third chapter, I think it is, he says, "I'm the most terrific liar you ever saw in your life." We see examples of this all throughout the book, places where he tells us that he enjoys lying, or we see him just kind of get out of hand. Like when he talks to Mrs. Morrow on the train, he starts telling her about how great her son is, when in reality he thinks that this kid is kind of a bully and a jerk. Or he lies to people about his age. He lies to people about his name. There's all kinds of stuff. But then what that means for us, in a book with an unreliable narrator, is that we can't just take everything that they say for absolute truth. We kind of have to look past the things they say and look at what they do, and also look at the way that other characters are responding to them. So for instance, later in the book, there's a scene where he is talking to Sally, telling her he wants to run away with her, and she keeps saying, "Stop yelling at me." And he tells us, "Oh, but I wasn't yelling." But she says this multiple times, "Stop yelling at me." And so that's a place where he's kind of accidentally revealing to us what is really going on there. So the thing with an unreliable narrator, it could be that the narrator's a liar. It could be the narrator is insane. I mean, we're all a little unreliable and biased towards our own perspective, in some respects. But with a novel with an unreliable narrator, you really do have to make an effort to look past what they're saying, what they're literally telling you, to try to figure out the reality of their situation or their characterization.